Where do you think you might use this?
I think what I'd like to do is maybe make a short documentary. I mean, this is one of the things I'm taking at school. Maybe just a 30-minute documentary of you, William Polk, who was in the Cuban Missile Crisis as a State Department official and has talked about it. I've got an oral history with already. And I've tentatively got an appointment with Dan Ellsberg in March.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to have, and I just started thinking on the way over, elders talking about nuclear war, giving a warning to this generation, something to that effect. If Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy would be interested in posting, either your interview alone or with, or something, putting it into a form like that. I mean, again, I want to put it to use.
Do you know the outfit that calls itself World Without War? Okay, well, I have a video on that site. Tony Jenkins, who's a peace educator who works with WWW, did a 15-minute interview with me on nuclear weapons and international law. And you can get it on YouTube. And they would be happy to have you use it.
This is Todd Pierce. It's February 9th, 2018. I'm here with Peter Weiss in New York, and to discuss his history, his oral history. And to begin with, Peter is an international lawyer. Peter, could you give us a little bit of your background as an international lawyer and how it is that you got into international law?
I got into international law through a wonderful professor at Yale Law School named McDougall, who taught international law at the law school when I was there in 1949. He was a very interesting person. He was from Mississippi, but he was very good on giving women a chance to advance in the law, and also in teaching international law. I think I still owe him a paper.
I hope you've got it done almost.
Right.
And after you left Yale, then what area did you go into with international law?
Well, when I first graduated from the law school, I didn't really know whether I wanted to practice law. And so I took a job as the executive officer of an organization called the International Development Placement Association, which was a precursor of the Point 4 program of President Truman, which very few people know about now, but he wanted to do something about economic development in what were then called underdeveloped areas. And I had spent a summer working with an outfit called the Foundation for World Government. And they financed an agency, the one that I ran for 2 years, which sent people with special skills in economic development to un, what at the time they called underdeveloped areas. So I did that for 2 years. Eventually, at the end of the 2 years, the two very conservative women who ran the charities section of IRS decided that we were just an employment agency and therefore we weren't entitled to charitable deductions. And I had to go out and get a law job.
So you have you've been an activist and an expert on nuclear arms. Back when you had graduated from law school, you were entering the legal field in the early 1950s, late 1940s, shortly after the nuclear bombs were dropped in Japan. What was your interest then, if any, on a nuclear war?
Well, like the vast majority of people in this country and in the world, I was shocked. But I was still in the army when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I was at that time posted to a very small detachment on an island in Boston Harbor called Long Island, not our Long Island, but the Massachusetts Long Island, which was a reception center for German rocket scientists. And that was my last assignment before I was demobbed. And when I think back about it, I find it really difficult to understand that so many people in the armed services were thankful for the dropping of the bombs because it ended the war with Japan, and as a result of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese finally surrendered, and they didn't have to go and do what otherwise they would have had to do, namely go and invade Japan and probably lose their lives. And to some extent, I was part of that also. They dropped the bomb, great thing. But it wasn't until John Hersey's book came out about the effects of the bombing and about these horrible deaths that so many people died. Because until then, it's curious because it relates to the way a lot of people are beginning to look at nuclear weapons now. At the time, we didn't think of them as something totally different from other weapons because of the enormity and the brutality of the damage that they inflicted and the fact that they left behind them after they were dropped the effects of radiation for untold decades or centuries. So I didn't really become involved in the anti-nuclear campaign until one day when I was sitting at my what I call my straight law office, which was intellectual property and trademarks in particular. And I got a call from a friend named Robert Bohm, who asked me if I had read an article, a law journal article by Richard Falk and a collaborator whose name I'm not remembering, which argued that nuclear weapons were in violation of international law, mainly because of the fact that the basic principle of judging the ethnic aspects of weapons was that weapons are intended to use military targets, and nuclear weapons cannot distinguish between civilian targets and military targets, and therefore nuclear weapons are illegal. And I think the article actually suggested that the issue be taken to the International Court of Justice. But when I got that call from Bob Bohm, he said, we have to start an organization to campaign against nuclear weapons. And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. Who's going to run it? And he said, you are. And that's how I got
What year was
into
this?
the anti-nuclear work.
What year is this?
Well, sometime in the 80s, early or middle 80s, I can't remember exactly. I could give you the date eventually, but
So before that, you had also been involved with protests against Vietnam, representing protesters, was that, or
yes,
in the 60s?
yes. That was working with the Center for Constitutional Rights. I had one case involving some members of the army, of the armed forces, who got orders for Vietnam. I got involved in that and in related cases. Also, I took a case for I don't know exactly what his rank was. I think he was a sergeant, maybe. He was convicted of a fragging. They call it fragging, like throwing grenades they were trying to protest the war in Vietnam, and I took a case on behalf of one of them who had been convicted, and I argued it in the Court of Appeals in Virginia, and we got his sentence considerably reduced, but not all the way.
Any other cases similar that you worked on with the Center for Constitutional Rights? Vietnam War protesters, or?
Yeah, probably. I'm not sure this particular case, because I remember going up to Portland and interviewing the guy and then arguing the case in Virginia. I think in the other cases it was more being involved with the cases than being lawyer of record.
Yeah. What led you to get involved with the Center for Constitutional Rights? And let me step back a second. You were obviously around during the McCarthy era. Is there anything you could say about that? And
I think the person who got me involved with that kind of law was Leonard Boudin, one of the leading constitutional lawyers at that time, who took cases in the Supreme Court and in lower courts. And actually, when I was looking for a job, he was a friend, and he offered me a job, but he had a very small office, and I didn't think I was right for it. But because of my friendship with him, which actually played a very important part in my life, because at one point I made a marriage proposal to my wife, my later wife, Cora, and she said she wanted to think about it. And then I invited her to have lunch with Leonard Boudin and me. And she was more political at the time than I was. And she was so impressed by the fact that I knew Leonard Boudin that she decided to marry me.
and Leonard Boudin is who you were partners with?
Well, no, I wasn't a partner of the firm. I was socially friendly with him. But I had great admiration for him and for the work he was doing. He was actually not very political himself, but he was a terrific lawyer in these political cases.
And was he with the Center for Constitutional Rights?
No, he was with the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which eventually, years later, merged with the Center for Constitutional Rights. The way I got into the Center for Constitutional Rights, now that I think of it, was another phone call. I got a phone call from Bill Kunstler, who was also a friend, and he and Arthur Canoe, who were with the Center for Constitutional Rights at the time, were defending a guy in New Mexico. Don't remember his first name. His second name was Tijerina. He was an activist with the Spanish, with the people of Spanish origin, who were arguing that their lands had been taken illegally from them in New Mexico. And Tijerina staged a raid on the court which had convicted him. It became known as the courthouse raid. And Bill Kunstler and Arthur Canoe agreed to take his case to the Supreme Court. And they called me and said that they had asked the ACLU, I don't know if I should put this on the record, but I guess it's all right. They had asked the ACLU to file an amicus brief, and so they called me to ask if I wanted to write the amicus. And I said yes. This was after the ACLU said yes, they agreed that there should be an appeal to the Supreme Court, but they couldn't, they didn't have the resources at the time to do the amicus brief, and they said, why don't you give us something and we'll look at it and maybe edit it, and if we like it, we'll use it. So that was the first thing that I ever did for CCR. And the Supreme Court did not take the case.
And maybe you could tell us a little more about the anti-nuclear campaign organization you founded, worked for, and anything you want to say about that in the 1980s.
Well, as I said before, the article by Richard Falk, who was also a close friend and a great progressive international law professor at Princeton, in the article, he and his collaborators suggested that the case be taken to the International Court of Justice. And the organization that I was asked to head in my spare time, the Lawyers' Committee on Nuclear Policy, was pushing the notion of going to the International Court of Justice, which eventually we succeeded in doing. But almost 10 years later, but it went to the International Court and they came out with a very good decision. Not perfect, but good in the sense that they ruled that the threat and use of nuclear weapons was generally a violation of international law. But they didn't have enough material at their disposal in the briefs that were filed by about 20 governments to decide whether there was ever a situation where they could be used legally. So they didn't say yes. Yes, nuclear weapons may be legal in an extreme case. They did not say that, although a lot of people misinterpret that decision to mean that they sanctioned the use in extreme cases. What they really said about that was what lawyers call a non-liquid, a lack of decision. So on the possibility of use in an extreme case, they weren't ruling one way or the other. But other than that, this several 100-page decision, one of the most important in the history of the court, was quite clear that they were opposed and of the view that international law prohibits the use of nuclear weapons.
What is the name of that case?
It's referred to as the nuclear weapons case.
Daniel
It
Ellsberg.
was a case for, it was not, it was an advisory opinion coming from the General Assembly. We went to the General Assembly to lobby for a majority decision in the General Assembly to request an advisory opinion. So we played a very important part there. And then we also played an important part in the hearing when it finally took place in 1995. One of the more amusing aspects, not that anything was very funny about it, but it was somewhat amusing that we were very worried that the pleadings to the International Court would wind up with the UK and the US, because governments appear in alphabetical order in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And we were aware of the fact that judges sometimes tend to pay more attention to what they just heard on a given day than what has been put before them for the last 2 weeks. So we had a tactical reunion to decide what to do about that. And what we decided was going to Zimbabwe and helping them with their brief, which would be on our side of the case. One of my colleagues spent the whole night before the argument with the lawyer for Zimbabwe. He did a very good job.
Daniel Ellsberg has written in his book that just came out, The Doomsday Machine, that in fact the United States has used nuclear weapons repeatedly as a threat to other countries since the attack on Japan.
Yes, I think he's right about that.
I've spoke to Bill Polk, who was in the State Department during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he's told me and others of how close we actually were to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in fact, so you think that means a risk of nuclear war in perpetuity?
Yes, I mean that's what the current U.S. position means. Rather than, I mean, what about the Russian nuclear arsenal? I mean, we're not saying we're not going to talk to Russia about anything until it drops its nuclear weapons.
Seems like, well, as you know, we've been talking about perpetual war now for a number of years. The Department of Defense actually uses that term, perpetual war. But when you look at what the United States has done since 2002, it seems like the United States has been the aggressor, starting with Iraq in 2003, and then Libya, and everything that the special operations are doing around the world. It seems understandable that North Korea might have some real concerns of their own government, considering our history recently.
Well, I don't think it's only our history with the countries that you mentioned, but it's principally with the position that emerges from spokespeople for the United States, like Vice President Pence. Whenever they talk about the situation with North Korea, they say, we are going to put more and more pressure on North Korea until they finally agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And yet when you ask, 4 out of 5 experts on North Korea, they will all tell you that there's just no way that they will ever say, we're giving up our nuclear weapons.
I've been doing some research on the Manhattan Project, and there's documents and records there at the Truman Presidential Library, I believe it is, where they actually, there's actually a memo explaining that they wanted a target, Nagasaki or Hiroshima, they wanted a target that had a large civilian population nearby that would be within range of the nuclear weapon. Doesn't seem like people really realize how we intended at the very beginning to use these weapons against a civilian population. If that's, again, that's part of the record.
Well, I'm not sure that you can make an airtight case that was part of official policy. But I'm sure that people involved with the nuclear issue in the U.S. military, I'm sure that there were people who would have regarded the killing of vast numbers of civilians as legitimate as a legitimate response to what they might have regarded as a possible attack on the United States.
And at that time, I believe as air commander, and then later during the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you had General LeMay, Curtis LeMay.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, I think everybody should recognize or does recognize how militaristic he was.
Well, it is part of official policy now. I'm not sure it was then, but now you have a president using phrases like fire and fury.
Right.
So I don't think there's no doubt in my mind that if Trump thinks we can get away with killing 1 million or 2 North Koreans without at the same time losing millions of South Koreans through a nuclear weapons response by North Korea, then he would authorize that. I have no doubt about that.
Do you have any suggestions? Obviously, you're still working at this with the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy and the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. But what do you have for recommendations, if any, or suggestions for people listening to you on what they should do to oppose the use of nuclear weapons in this age now that we're in, a perpetual war?
We're in a situation now where a large part of the U.S. population really has no sense of what a nuclear war would be like. I saw a video not long ago where a bunch of students were asked, I don't remember by whom, but they were asked what they thought about a nuclear war, and basically what they said was, well, it's just another weapon. And in answer to your question about what should be done, if there could be the kind of mobilization against nuclear weapons that there was during the Cold War, I think it would help a lot to make the policy makers in Washington abandon this notion that, say, if, according to the Nuclear Posture Review that came out a week ago, if the situation now is, you know, we're going to be making smaller nuclear weapons, mini nukes. What's a mini nuke? I mean, is a mini nuke something that only kills 100,000 people instead of 1 million? Or 1 million people instead of 10 million? Seems to me that's where we are right now. And I don't get the sense that people realize what I don't even say what a nuclear incident would do to result in a real nuclear war, because the Nuclear Posture Review also now authorizes the use of nuclear weapons against conventional weapons, against cyber attacks. So there's no real policy to stop Trump from ordering a nuclear strike. And you probably know that there are people in Congress trying to get laws passed that would require a number of other high-placed people in the administration to agree to the use of nuclear weapons. But I think that's an insufficient way to deal with it. Because look at this scenario that I'm going to give you. The U.S. gets an order from the president to do fire and fury in North Korea without nuclear weapons, just with the overwhelming capacity that we have with ICBMs and other non-nuclear weapons. What is going to be the result? I mean, what's going to be the reaction from North Korea? It's going to be the launch of nuclear weapons against South Korea, possibly against Japan, certainly against Guam, where we have 300,000 people. So the people in Congress who are working, who've introduced these bills that would restrain, to some extent, the use of nuclear weapons by a president acting alone. I'm not looking at this scenario. It shouldn't be the president alone can't start a nuclear war. It should be the president alone can't start a war.
I think that identifies one of the fundamental problems we're having today, we're faced with.
Right.
So anything else you might want to add? I think that's been quite eloquent, what you were just saying about what we need to do. But I guess if there's anything else you want to add before we stop here?
Well, you asked before, what can be done. Cora, my wife, who you know, who was very active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, thinks that we should try to have digitalized teachings. Teachings are very effective in educating people about the war in Vietnam. And now we have all of this technology at our disposal. And it may be useful to start with some elementary aspects of nuclear weapons that are not sufficiently known by a sufficiently large group of American citizens. Starting with a question like, what is a nuclear weapon? What is a low-yield nuclear weapon? What is an ICBM? Who has the authority to start a war by any kind of weapon? But it would take a kind of resources that I don't see as being available right now. Certainly, at the very least, the people who brought about the adoption of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, who have organized and energized a fairly significant number of new people, should think about doing old-fashioned teach-ins at universities and colleges throughout the country. And, maybe there would be a possibility eventually of having a major conference that would get coverage in the media. I'm, like many people, I'm very troubled now by the fact that that there is no comprehension of, every once in a while you find somebody saying it might mean the end of life on the planet as we know it. I don't think it would do that. It wouldn't be the life of the planet as we know it, but it could be a situation or a result of such enormous proportions that it could be a good piece of the planet. So you don't even have to talk about the end of life, you know? But you should be talking about the possibility of millions and millions of people dying a death in the most horrible circumstances and leaving the areas in which there have been explosions or where the radiation has traveled as a result of explosions in another area, where those areas are made completely uninhabitable. I don't think any substantial number of people in this country are aware of that right now.
Well, should we stop here?
Okay.
Very instructive, obviously concerning. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. What can I offer you now? Would you like some coffee?
Look at those cookies.
Help yourself.